Bom, queridos amigos, queridas amigas da TV Solnik, da TV 247, parece que começou a guerra lá no Golfo Pérsico. O Irã acaba de atingir duas bases militares americanas no Iraque com mais de uma dúzia de mísseis. Não se sabe ainda se há mortos, certamente haverá mortos, porque há soldados nessas bases, evidentemente. Há mortos, há feridos, não se sabe exatamente quantos, porque a notícia é muito recente, aconteceu agora há pouco, e o que eu proponho para vocês é acompanharmos juntos o noticiário da CNN a respeito.
Yet know anything about casualties. This attack, though, is a game changer. According to the military, the Pentagon has just confirmed that these rockets were fired from Iran. They were ballistic missiles. There were more than a dozen of them, 2 bases targeted. Fred Peiken is out front live in Tehran. I want to go back to you, Fred. We have just obviously heard from the Pentagon about these ballistic missiles. What more are you learning now?
Well, the Iranians also coming up with more information as well. It's quite interesting because on the Tasnim news network, which is one of the news networks here, they are saying the second wave of rockets barrage has started against American bases. Now, whether or not that includes the bases that we were just talking about, those 2 that have already been struck, or whether or not there's other barrages that are still being fired by the Iranians at this point is very much unclear. But they are saying, and this comes from a statement that the RIGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, put out. The statement is entitled, "This is the beginning of," and I'm paraphrasing here, "of hard revenge." And that was something that the Iranians were saying that they wanted after the killing of Qasem Soleimani, a hard revenge, a strong revenge, strong strikes. It's what we heard from protesters also as we were at the funeral procession for Qasem Soleimani as well. Of course, highly significant that you have these ballistic missiles that are being used. They are the weapon in the arsenal of the Revolutionary Guard specifically, that they say is the most sophisticated. They spent a lot of time, a lot of energy, sophisticated
imagens do ataque.
Obviously, this is something
Base
they
de
are not
Al-Assad,
only saying that they're able to strike
240 quilômetros de Bagdá.
in Iraq, but they're able to do so with conventional weapons and not just
Maria Lúcia, eu não acho que seja o começo da Terceira Guerra, mas certamente o começo da guerra Irã e Estados Unidos.
Tweeted, his name is Saeed Jalili, he's an advisor to the Supreme Leader. He came out and he tweeted an image of the Iranian flag, which seems to indicate that he's maybe mocking President Trump or taking reference to President Trump, obviously, tweeting out the American flag after
O ataque foi da Guarda Revolucionária, aquela comandada pelo Soleimani.
All right, Fred, thank you very much. We're going to go back to Fred in just a few minutes, obviously, as he's getting new information. Colonel Cedric Layton is with us tonight, our military analyst, Colonel Peter Mansour, former aide to General David Petraeus during the Iraq War, Pamela Brown, our senior White House correspondent, and Jim Sciutto, national security correspondent. Colonel Layton, what's your response here to what Fred is just reporting now, that one of the Iranian news agencies is reporting now the beginning of a second wave, and that this is, quote, the beginning of hard revenge?
Well, clearly, Aaron, this is an escalation, and if the Iranian reports are true that Fred mentioned, then what they're doing is they're not only going with one wave of an attack, but at least 2 waves. Whether or not there'll be subsequent waves of missile attacks, that of course is an open question at the present time. But they seem to be asking for a U.S. response to what they're doing. There's no way that the United States can let this kind of an attack go unanswered, and I'm afraid we're approaching the point of escalation.
Não acredito que a Rússia entre no meio. Não há nenhuma notícia a respeito disso. Nada de catastrofismo, por favor.
Very significant. The last time Iran launched missiles at Iraq was during the 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq War.
Não se sabe quantos mortos, quantos feridos. Vamos ver o que vai acontecer agora.
Americans, but they can also kill the Iraqis that are stationed on those bases. So they're in danger as well. And my guess is these strikes are just the first of a number to come in the days ahead. I would
claro que o Trump agora vai responder, né?
Limited to a couple of waves on 2 air bases. So more to follow. And like Colonel Layton said, this will spark retaliation by the Trump administration and potentially into Iran proper, so that you'll have U.S. weapons landing on Iranian soil, and that also is an enormous escalation.
I mean, that, Jim Sciutto, is a war.
Yeah.
And so you have the President of the United States today saying that he would attack if he needed to for retribution. That was before this happened. You have his tweet from a couple days ago when he said if Iran should strike any U.S. person or target, the United States will quickly and fully strike back, and perhaps in a disproportionate manner.
A couple things significant. The idea that these were missiles, not rockets, because missiles carry a lot of a payload. The potential for destruction, but also loss of life is enormous here. And the fact that it came from Iranian territory, according to the Pentagon statement, also significant, because to this point, Iran has hidden behind proxies, largely the attacks on the tankers, the attack on the Saudi oil facility, the attack on the U.S. embassy. This would come directly from Iran. It would mean that Iran, and you see that even with tweeting out a picture of the Iranian flag, is not shy about saying, this is coming from us, right? We're not going to hide behind anything. And that, of course, then forces America's hand in terms of how it responds, as to echo what Colonel Mansour said, likely on Iranian soil. I mean, the president has tweeted that he has targets in Iran
52 targets,
as a possibility. And as that would take place, you have to imagine that this becomes a serious military operation. Of course, the U.S. has the option of launching missiles as well, but it also has the option of attacks from the air. That would require taking out surface-to-air missile positions in Iran. Those are staffed by Iranian soldiers. Remember, when Trump pulled back from responding to the shoot-down of the U.S. drone, target at the time included positions in Iran where he pulled back because he was concerned about the loss of Iranian life. If you were launching an operation like that, that is a risk to Iranian soldiers, and then Iran responds to that. Anyway, you see very quickly how you...
Well, that's right. You end up at a point of no return. I want to go to Alex Marquardt out in Washington with some breaking news here about the Secretary of Defense. What are you learning, Alex?
Well, Aaron, in the past half hour, as we were just getting these reports and these claims of responsibility, I should say, from the IRGC, we know that the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper's office, did reach out to the specifically to the Prime Minister's office in Baghdad. Now, of course, it is the middle of the night. I understand there were some difficulties getting through, according to a diplomatic source, but at this point, in the wake of this attack, there has been communication at the highest levels between the U.S. and Iraqi government. Now, of course, I imagine
Vamos esperar, né?
asking questions.
Agora tem que esperar o anúncio de quantos mortos, quantos feridos, e vai ter uma resposta do Trump, é claro, porque o Trump vai querer agora evitar novos ataques.
Difficult position. They depend on both. Each country is a patron of Iraq, and now they find themselves essentially at ground zero for what could be a massive conflagration between the two sides. That is not where they want to be. If you think about what's happened in the past few months,
a Guarda Revolucionária está prometendo mais ataques, mais agressões. Bem, é claro que o Trump vai responder agora também, vai responder com uma ação militar massiva para evitar novos ataques aos cidadãos americanos, porque afinal de contas deve ter morrido muitos soldados nesse ataque.
All right, Alex, thank you. We have more news coming in from Baghdad. We're going to go there in just a moment as our breaking news coverage continues. We are also just learning that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and the Defense Secretary Mark Esper have just arrived at the White House, presumably to meet with the President of the United States. We'll be right back.
This is the 100 Club. Our look at companies
Desculpe. Então, isso aí realmente começou a guerra, né? Não a terceira guerra, muita calma, não é a terceira guerra, mas a guerra entre Estados Unidos e o Irã, né? A vingança deve ter matado muitos soldados americanos e o Trump vai querer uma resposta também muito agressiva, né? Uma resposta militar. Tomara que ele não veja alvos civis, mas aconteceu de fato o que o Irã tinha prometido uma dura vingança, e a vingança começou. E agora os Estados Unidos, que tem 50 mil soldados ali na região, enviou mais 4.500 e que tem um poder de fogo muito maior do que o Irã, vai responder, né? Vai responder atingindo também bases militares iranianas. Quer dizer, é o começo da guerra, é o estopim da guerra Estados Unidos, Iraque, Irã, desculpe, Estados Unidos, Irã. Eu acho que a ONU vai convocar o Conselho de Segurança para discutir, mas hoje vai ser uma longa noite. Agora é madrugada lá em Bagdá, 5 horas da manhã. Então, o que eu proponho é que assistamos juntos a CNN para sabermos mais notícias, né? Não temos nenhuma condição a não ser acompanhar a CNN, né? A CNN é a maior emissora americana e é a única emissora global. Então, as notícias mais quentes e mais completas vamos ver aqui na CNN. Então, eu proponho isso aí a vocês. Eu não posso traduzir simultaneamente, não tenho essa condição também, não entendo assim, palavra por palavra, mas vamos saber, né? Vamos saber no decorrer da noite o que vai acontecer. A China e a Rússia, por enquanto, estão em silêncio. Eu acho que não interessa nem a China nem a Rússia entrar militarmente nessa guerra. Mas o Irã resolveu entrar sozinho, né? O que vai fazer? Os caras são malucos também, né? Os caras resolveram peitar os Estados Unidos sozinhos, sem nenhum apoio da Rússia e da China, né? Milhões de pessoas saíram às ruas, pediram vingança, agora tivemos a vingança. E a vingança aconteceu muito mais rapidamente do que as pessoas estavam esperando, do que eu estava esperando. Porque ainda estão acontecendo os funerais, né? 3 dias de funerais. Hoje, inclusive, funeral na cidade natal do Soleimani foi suspenso por causa de tumulto. Já houve mais de 50 mortes nesses funerais, muitos feridos também. E o Irã respondeu de surpresa, antes do esperado, porque os Estados Unidos mandaram hoje 4.500 soldados para lá. Vamos ver o que diz a CNN, tá?
Ago here, according to the Pentagon, they have confirmed Iran launched more than a dozen ballistic missiles targeting 2 bases in Iraq where American troops are stationed, Al-Assad Air Base and in Erbil. According to the military, these ballistic missiles were fired from Iranian sovereign territory. This is video Iran claims shows the missiles coming in to the Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq.
Esse é o vídeo do ataque. Mais de 12 mísseis.
We are now learning that the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Defense Secretary Mark Esper have just arrived at the White House. The President now meeting with his national security team. Caitlin Collins is out front at the White House. Caitlin, the huge question here is, the President who earlier today said he would attack Iran in retribution if they struck back, and who earlier said in a tweet he could strike in perhaps
7:30 da noite em Washington,
is now facing an attack from Iran, which is a game changer in and of itself, with ballistic missiles targeting U.S. troops. Any understanding here on what they're talking about in terms of response?
Well, Anna, we know the president almost specifically previewed this happening, saying that if Iran did strike an airbase that had American troops at it, that the United States would respond.
Vamos conversar, vamos ouvir o que está acontecendo, vamos entender a situação.
A little under an hour ago, the White House said the president was consulting with his national security.
Claro que está havendo agora a reunião do Mike Pompeo com o Trump.
We now know that's happening in person because it's not just the Defense Secretary Esper here arriving, as you saw him carrying that big bag with him. The Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was also seen arriving just a few moments before. He was seen sitting in the back seat of his car, pulling up. That's right outside the West Wing. Pompeo was seen reading some materials, and then you can see the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, following all of them. So all of the top national security aides are now inside the West Wing with the president as they're going over this, and we're waiting to see how it is they're going to respond. Now, the president is pretty familiar with one of these air bases because he visited it in 2018, and then the Vice President, Mike Pence, who has also been on the phone tonight with Democrats on Capitol Hill, was just there a few months ago in November when he visited the troops at Thanksgiving. So we're still waiting to see what it is, that how the president is going to respond, but he has been foreshadowing that he would respond, and like you said, maybe in a manner that was not proportionate to their attack.
All right, thank you very much, Caitlin Collins. I want to go live to Baghdad now. Arwa Damon is out front there. Arwa, what are you learning now? We know, of course, Secretary of Defense has been in touch with the Iraqi Prime Minister in Baghdad. What are you hearing?
Well, we're just beginning to get a little bit of information as to what may have happened. This is from an Iraqi security source who is telling us that there are casualties at the Al-Assad air base. He does not know at this stage how many, whether it is killed or wounded, but we are hearing that they are on the Iraqi side. This base, like many of the bases in Iraq that houses U.S. forces, also houses Iraqi forces. Al-Assad itself is a massive, huge, sprawling complex that does have a U.S. and an Iraqi side. So at this stage, we are hearing reports about casualties on the Iraqi side. And in this kind of warfare that has been unfolding so far, whether it's when the Iranian proxies here end up firing at U.S. locations or the other types of attacks that do take place, oftentimes Iraqi security forces, because they are co-located, do end up also suffering casualties on their side as well. Given the dynamics that have been unfolding here, Aaron, what we don't know is if this is the start of something bigger, like Iran and its proxies in Iraq have been promising, or if this is some sort of message to the U.S., because right now the Iranian-backed proxies here have really begun upping their rhetoric when it comes to their desire to see American forces out of Iraq. This is not just about revenge for what took place. This is about seeing, at least for them, American forces leaving.
All right, Arwa Damon, thank you very much. We're going to go back to Arwa as she gets more. Of course, there are 5,000 American troops stationed around Iraq at this moment. I want to go now to Democratic Congressman Eliot Engel of New York. He is chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. The chairman, is this now a war?
Well, it could very well be, and the president and his crew better figure out a way to sort of tone down everything, because we could be in the middle of a full-fledged war, and I don't think that's something anybody wants. There's no doubt that America would win any kind of war, but the casualties would be horrific, and I don't think the American people are ready for it. I know Congress is not ready for it, and you know, you had to expect that there would be some retaliation such as this. I don't like the regime in Tehran, but I don't think we want to war with them.
So the president earlier today said he would attack. That's his word. He would attack in retribution if Iran were to strike any sort of an air base or anything like that. And he also, as I mentioned a few days ago, said that he would engage in a disproportionate response if he felt like it, and that it didn't matter what Congress said, that he could do that. Do you believe that Secretary Esper, Secretary Pompeo are going to be able to talk to him tonight and get him to not do something like that?
Well, I would hope so. You know, talk is cheap, and bluster is cheap, and we can, you know, all be the toughest guy on the block and, you know, dare someone to knock our head off. But that's really irresponsible. I think what we have to do now is tone down the rhetoric on all sides and try to see how we can sort of extricate ourselves from this nightmare, because I don't think the American people want to go to war. And, you know, the irony is, we talk about Iran and Iraq, you know, the United States, really, in my view, is really responsible for making Iran the hegemonic power in the region, because by knocking off Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and you remember that Iraq and Iran kept having these wars fighting each other. So what we did was we drove Iraq closer to Iran and made Iran the hegemonic power in the region, which is not what we wanted to do. So I hope the president...
O que ele está dizendo é que os americanos não querem a guerra, ele espera que o Trump não revide. Ele não gosta do regime iraniano, mas não quer que os Estados Unidos entrem em guerra. Agora parece que é o estopim da guerra, né?
You are whatever your feelings about how we got to this point, you now have more than a dozen ballistic missiles fired at 2 air bases where U.S. troops are stationed. Unclear if there are
Vai ser
American
uma longa
casualties,
noite
unclear if
hoje.
Iran intended for there not to be American casualties. We just don't know, but we do know that this is a game changer, right? They launched them from inside Iran, their sovereign territory. They launched them at American interests. Doesn't the president have to do something?
Well, the president has to do something, but he doesn't need to exacerbate the situation and make it tit for tat, and before you know it, we're in a full-fledged war. Look, you can't be belligerent and then when it doesn't work the way you had hoped, turn around and just walk away. There are consequences here. One of the things that I've had difficulty with this administration is that we don't seem to be utilizing any of our allies. We don't seem to care about any of the groups we belong to, like NATO. The president seems to trash them, and we could be using the help of
Deve ter
some
morrido
of our
soldados,
NATO
uma base
allies
cheia de
right now,
soldados.
and hopefully the president and common heads will prevail and will do something
Mas não há
like that.
informações oficiais.
You know, again,
Esse
they're not
ataque foi em duas
sweethearts in the
bases
government in,
dos Estados
in
Unidos
Iran.
no Iraque,
But on the other hand, do we really
a
want
200
to
quilômetros de
war? I think the
Bagdá.
answer is no.
All right, thank you very much, Chairman Engel. I appreciate your time tonight. The panel is back with me, and also joining us now on the phone, Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, who was the commander of the U.S. Task Force in northern Iraq. General, what's your reaction here as this news is coming in? Ballistic missiles from Iran. They're threatening a second wave. Unclear what that means, targeting 2 U.S. bases.
Yeah, a couple of things there, and I'll start by saying, preface everything I say by the fact that it's very easy to fall into a war and to start a war. It's a whole lot more difficult to extricate yourself from it. What we're seeing now is an update of the strategic game by Iran. These are ballistic missiles, as some of your previous folks have already said. This is very different than launching a couple of rockets at a military base, which Iran proxies have done in the past. This is a cross-border operation with a large ballistic missile, missiles that Iran has a lot of, that they've not only made themselves, but they've also purchased from Russia. Second thing, they are sending some very specific messages. As I see it, this attack started about the same time of day that Soleimani was hit by a drone strike. So there is even a message in that. The fact that you have some members of the Iranian government tweeting out Iranian flags is trolling at the strategic level to our president. And then third, I think one of the big things is that Iraq is now right smack in the middle of this, and they are strategically driving more of a wedge between the United States and Iraq in terms of striking a target on Iraqi soil at their very first attempt to counter the U.S. forces. So that's sending a message to not only us, but to Iraq. If they are going to allow the U.S. to strike forces from off their soil, then be prepared to have more trauma within the government of Iraq. And this is one of the things that Barham Saleh, their president, has said specifically, that he didn't want to see Iraq go back into a cycle of. Unfortunately, because of what we now see as the potential for a huge proxy war between Iran and Iran and the United States, Iraq is going to be pulled into it. And then you have just the fact that you just reported the majority of the casualties seem to be on the Iraqi side. That's going to further inflame not only the Iraqi government, but the Iraqi people.
Yes, which I think is a crucial point. And again, that's very preliminary. It's from an Iraqi source. So we don't know yet anything on the American side. Pam, what are you hearing about the president's response? What Secretaries Esper and Pompeo are saying to him right now?
Well, this is a critical decision-making point for the president. The biggest decision, essentially, he'll probably have to make in his presidency beyond the strike against Soleimani. And there's a lot to discuss. Of course, they're looking at retaliatory options. It wasn't long ago, you keep pointing out, Aaron, that it was the president who tweeted, if Iran strikes American interests or personnel, Iran itself will be hit very fast, very hard, saying we are the biggest, by far the best in the world.
O que o Trump vai fazer agora. Está reunido nesse momento com Mike
So the
Pompeo.
president essentially drew a red line for himself, and now we're seeing this play out. Iran is retaliating after the strike, and now the ball is in the president's court in terms of how he's going to respond. This is a president who has said many times he doesn't want to go to war with Iran. He's campaigned on this idea of getting out of foreign entanglements, and now he is in this position where he said he's going to respond. It's also worth noting, Aaron, that some of the intelligence that led to the strike against Soleimani, I'm told by a source, was concern about an imminent attack on the Al-Assad air base. And so, to General Hertling's point, it does also appear that Iran is trying to send a signal that you may have taken off one of our key players or military players, but we are still capable of causing great harm. Aaron.
All right, all of you stay with me. Our breaking news continues. We are getting more information here about casualties. Our reporters are working on that, and as soon as we are able to get that to you, we will. We are also learning Vice President Mike Pence just briefed congressional leaders. We're going to give you what we learned from that. We're going to take a brief break, come back with everything as we gather it.
It's a really welcoming place, and that's become more true over
Bom,
the last
enquanto
10
está no
years.
intervalo,
Especially in the coastal areas.
vamos continuar aqui conversando. Vocês estão entendendo, né, o que está acontecendo? Agora está rolando uma reunião na Casa Branca, Trump, Mike Pompeo, outros assessores de segurança, e vão decidir o que vão fazer. Claro que primeiro vão esperar notícias, devem estar recebendo informações das bases, né, quantas mortes, quantos feridos, se houve mortos, se houve feridos, e com base nisso é que eles vão agir, né? Vão determinar novas ações, né? Ao que tudo indica, Trump vai responder de alguma forma. Né? O que o Irã está querendo com esse ataque? Está querendo expulsar os Estados Unidos. Né? Os Estados Unidos, que são muito mais poderosos, não vão querer ser expulsos. Então, vamos ver o que acontece. Eu acho que o Conselho de Segurança da ONU deverá ser convocado para amanhã, agora é noite. E Nova York é mais ou menos o mesmo horário daqui, né? Washington é um pouco menos, 2 horas a menos. Lá no Iraque está amanhecendo agora. Então, o que eu proponho para vocês, fiquemos aqui ouvindo as notícias da CNN, é claro, sempre vou comentar nos intervalos, mas essa é a melhor fonte de informação, porque a CNN, né, tem repórter no todo, e vai ser a primeira a noticiar as novidades. E vamos ver qual será a resposta da Casa Branca. Não houve até agora nenhuma declaração do Trump a respeito, só o Pentágono se pronunciou, um pronunciamento somente informativo. 2 bases foram atingidas, mais de 1 dúzia de mísseis foram disparados, mas ainda sem informações de vítimas. Agora, inclusive não ter vítimas, né? Base militar cheia de soldados, claro que vai ter vítimas, dependendo da quantidade de mortos, que será traçada a estratégia agora dos Estados Unidos. Né? A mim parece que é um estopim de uma guerra entre Estados Unidos e Irã. Não acredito em Terceira Guerra Mundial, não acredito que a Rússia entre no meio, não acredito que a China entre no meio, mas até agora não se sabe de nenhuma declaração nem de país da Europa, nem da China, nem da Rússia a respeito, muito menos de Bolsonaro. Né? Bolsonaro, aliás, foi aconselhado a ficar aqui, então não deverá responder nada, já deve estar sob tutela dos generais do seu governo, que o aconselharam a ficar quietinho, porque falar é pior. A CNN agora está no intervalo, vamos ver, quando eles voltarem no intervalo eu vou colocar vocês em contato direto. Eu acho que essa é a maneira mais segura de sabermos o que está acontecendo. Ó, voltou.
All right, we are following the breaking news. More than a dozen missiles launched from Iran's territory, hitting 2 major air bases in Iraq where American troops are based. And we now just have video. This, we believe, shows the moment some of the missiles hit the Al-Assad air base. This is cell phone video from someone who is there. We can't independently confirm it, but this is what we understand it is. I want to play it for you.
Dentro da base fingida. Que horror, né?
And you could see more of them coming in, as we said, more than a dozen. Jim Sciutto's here with me. Obviously, you hear the explosions, then you see the lights, the more explosions. Arwas talked about the massive size of this base. Those are obviously cell phone video from the Iraq side.
In the simplest terms, these were big missiles, right? I mean, the sound and the explosion, and this is, as we were saying earlier, the fact that they were missiles and not rockets, according to the Pentagon, that's a more significant way to attack with greater damage and greater danger to life. And the fact that the U.S. says that they came from Iran means that Iran is not reluctant to make clear that this is coming from them. They're not hiding behind proxies as they have with previous attacks. And as we are now reporting, there are casualties, we believe, confined to Iraqi forces there. So this is the use of potentially deadly force. All of those things qualify this as a significant response on the part of the Iraqis to the killing of Soleimani. The open questions now, one, were there waves of attacks like this? Right. Two, also crucially, were the U.S. casualties here? We don't know.
Right, and they had in one Iranian state TV saying a second wave was beginning in the hard revenge. We don't know what that meant, whether that referred to what we've already seen or what we perhaps have not yet seen. We just don't know.
Well, I can assure you those bases are bracing themselves for exactly that.
Colonel Mansour, let me ask you, because we don't yet know the casualty situation. We do, though, know that we understand that there are casualties on the Iraqi side. We don't know anything about the inside of the base at this point. However, when you look at what this is, sophisticated ballistic missiles launched from Iran proper at a base. If they wanted to strike specific American troops, would they have done so?
They have the capability to target specific parts of the base. I believe their ballistic missiles have the guidance systems to do that. So, and we'll know more tomorrow when people wake up and can assess the damage, what exactly was targeted. But to my knowledge, the Iranian missiles are guided. They're not simply like the old Scud missiles that are fire and forget and you hope for the best.
Yeah.
All right, let me go to Caitlin Collins at the White House right now. Caitlin, you have a development from the president.
Yeah, that's right, Aaron. As the president is meeting with his national security advisors that you just saw at the White House, we are now being told that urgent preparations are being made for the president to potentially address the nation on these attacks tonight. Now, there is still a lot being learned. Information is being gathered, as you see there. The Defense Secretary and Secretary of State are meeting with the president right now. But two officials tell my colleague Jeff Zeleny that right now they are preparing for the president to address the nation tonight from the Oval Office. Now, we've got to express a lot of caution here because sometimes these things can be delayed as they are gathering more information about these attacks. But right now, we are expecting to hear from the president tonight based on these current plans, which my colleague Jeff Zeleny is reporting. Now, this would be notable because last week when that strike happened, we did not hear from the president beyond a tweet of the American flag until the next day when they rushed reporters in at the last minute and he talked about that strike that killed that top Iranian commander. But now it does sound like, based on what we're hearing, we may hear from the president in the Oval Office tonight, which would be significant. I think it would be the second time we've ever heard from the president address the nation in prime time from the Oval Office.
General Hertling, as we prepare for this possibility and a very significant moment and night for this country, I want to put this question to you because it may end up being important. We don't know anything about U.S. casualties, and that obviously is going to be hugely significant. If there were none, though, was that intentional by Iran to not have there be American casualties, to provide an off-ramp?
No, I don't think we can read into that, Aaron. I agree with what Pete Mansour said, that while the Iranian missiles are a little bit better than the Scuds, they don't have the precision type of capability that many of our missiles have. They will hit a general area, and I think that there was the requirement or the desire to cause casualties, to strike a target. And if it turns out that there were more Iraqis than Americans that were either injured or killed by this strike, I don't think that was intentional. It was not a target, in my view, an initial assessment. I'm sure others will be able to determine this, but it was probably not an intentional approach to strike Iraqi versus a U.S. target.
Which is a significant statement. I want to go to Fred Peiken back in Iran right now. Fred, obviously we're reporting that President Trump may be about to address the nation with a message that will, of course, be seen in Tehran. What are you hearing there?
Well, we've gotten the full statement by the IRGC now. We've heard, of course, Aaron, before that on state TV here, you had banners sort of outlining part of the message from the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has, of course, said that it is
Imagina a situação do correspondente americano em Teherã. Ele não deve estar se sentindo muito seguro.
The title of the statement say they pledge hard revenge, as they call it, for Qasem Soleimani's death. And it's been so interesting, Aaron, because over the past couple of days, as we've been at the funeral procession for Qasem Soleimani, there were so many people there who had placards that simply had two words on them: hard revenge or harsh revenge. So this seems to be something that's been building up, that the Iranian Power Center has been building up for, to almost label this operation, this revenge operation, as they call it, and just call it hard revenge. Now, there's 4 points that the Revolutionary Guard makes there. They say to the great Satan, obviously referencing the United States, saying that the slaughterous American regime is warned not to repeat its wickedness. Essentially what the Iranians are saying there, Aaron, and I think this is something that's key, because the senior advisor to the Supreme Leader told me the same thing as well. They are saying that this is their retaliation and they want it to end there. They don't want America to strike back, and they said, and they're essentially saying that they don't want this to turn into a larger war. And that doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be the only retaliation, or this is going to be the only strikes that we're going to see. But the Iranians are essentially warning President Trump and the U.S. not to continue and escalate the situation any further. They're then warning other governments in the region not to provide the U.S. with any capabilities to launch attacks at Iran, saying that any governments that do so would also become targets for Iran as well. They then threaten Israel, saying that they don't consider what they call a Zionist regime to be separate from America. And then, and finally, this is also quite interesting, they urge the American people to call on American troops from the region to prevent further casualties and not allow essentially the Trump administration to endanger their lives. So obviously, essentially telling American forces in that region not to follow President Trump's orders, if those are to attack Iran. So you can see they seem to have put the statement out, or they seem to have drafted the statement at least well in advance. This does appear more and more, Aaron, like a very, very concerted and orchestrated retaliation by the Iranians.
Extremely so. General Hertling, though, you heard what Fred saying, they're seeming to indicate that they don't want this to go further. But there's no way the United States... Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. And the other thing that I would point out is if this was a commanded strike, in other words, if the government of Iran actually said execute this strike, and it certainly appears that it does, this being the first wave is something that I think the American military has feared in terms of our dealings with Iran. Because first of all, if it's a strike from the government of Iran, again, bringing the Iraqi government into this and having a proxy war on Iraqi territory, that's one dynamic that we can ill afford to approach. The other thing is there are literally hundreds of proxy forces, not with ballistic missiles, but just rockets that could fire on U.S. forces throughout the Middle East. And we're not just talking about Iraq, but in places like Yemen, in Syria, in Somalia, and the list could go on, to include potentially Lebanon, Jordan, and even Israel.
So Jim, we'll see what the president says tonight. But I think that it is important to emphasize to people watching how important two other people are tonight: Mike Pompeo and Mark Esper.
Absolutely.
They're in that room with him right now.
And keep in mind as well that Mike Pompeo, to our knowledge, has been pushing for a forceful response to Iran for some months prior to this, and was apparently behind the Soleimani killing for some time. So his posture, you might say, is more forward-leaning. But again, both sides have opportunities to calibrate their responses here. Possible Iran calibrated theirs tonight. how does the U.S. respond? That's the key question.
And those are the crucial questions here at this moment. Every second counting as we are learning more and still have so many questions. We do not yet know details about any American casualties. We do, however, know that there were casualties on the Iraqi side. Unclear whether they are killed or wounded. Huge night unfolding. Our coverage continues now with Anderson Cooper.
Good evening. Tonight, just days after U.S. drone strike killed a top Iranian general and terror organizer, American troops who come under missile fire in Iraq and Iran is claiming responsibility. According to the Pentagon, more than a dozen surface-to-surface ballistic missiles were launched from Iran, targeting at least 2 Iraqi bases housing Americans and coalition personnel. One at Al-Assad, the other in Erbil. President Trump visited Al-Assad a little more than a year ago. This is video from Iranian state TV. We can't independently vouch for it, but it claims to be a missile of missiles falling on Al-Assad. The question is what happens next, of course. Will President Trump respond, or how will he respond? Remember, just 2 days ago, this is what he promised in a tweet. Quoting now, the United States just spent $2 trillion on military equipment. We are the biggest and by far the best in the world. If Iran attacks an American base or any American, we will be sending some of that brand new beautiful equipment their way, and without hesitation. We have correspondents in all 3 capitals, Washington, Baghdad, and Tehran. I want to first check in with our CNN's Barbara Starr. So what's the latest from the Pentagon?
Latest from the Pentagon, Anderson, is they say that more than a dozen, we now know them to be short-range ballistic missiles, were fired from inside Iran against these positions at Al-Assad and Erbil, both locations inside Iraq that host U.S. forces. So we now have firing of weapons, very significant weapons, from inside Iran, and that means absolutely no question regime backing. There's simply no question about that. This is something that the U.S. had been watching for. We don't know that any of those incoming missiles were shot down by any U.S. assets. They had seen, or we had reported that they had seen Iran move its ballistic missiles around in the last few days, so they were certainly on watch for this. But, if you're talking about retaliation, Iran has a very large ballistic missile inventory spread out in key areas. They have also moved their weapons around. The U.S. assesses for essentially survival, worried about U.S. retaliation. If the U.S. wants to move into Iranian airspace and launch strikes against missile sites or other targets inside Iran, it can be done, but it is a very dangerous business. Iran has significant air defenses. Their military is not one of the most modern in the world by any stretch, but they would have the capability to try and shoot down any U.S. aircraft. We know that if the U.S. was going to go launch something against the Iranian regime, it would be by aircraft and by sea, U.S. ships at sea, perhaps launching missiles. This is the way they could avoid those air defenses most significantly. But let's be clear, tonight, the Pentagon says it is still assessing the situation on the ground inside Iraq, trying to determine exactly what damage, what has happened, and we will then see how President Trump decides to move ahead.
And Barbara, just talk a little bit about the significance that ballistic missiles were used.
Well, what we have seen over the months is rockets and mortars. This is so-called indirect fire. It's those militia groups inside Iraq that can readily use those, relatively lightweight, shoot and scoop kind of thing. They do cause damage, but most of the time they don't, because they're very inaccurate. That's the category of rockets and mortars that we have seen for months. This, ballistic missiles, they have to be fueled up. They have to be put on a launcher. There has to be a crew to man it and send and fire it off. The Iranians would have to have the intelligence. They'd have to understand in terms of weapons firing exactly where Al-Assad is, exactly where Erbil is, and be able to fire against those targets with some level of precision.
Which obviously the Iranians have. I mean, given their involvement in Iraq, they have been backing these Shia proxy forces.
Sure. But what this tells us tonight, Anderson, is tonight, the real issue, I think it's fair to say, is the Iranian regime from inside the relative safety of their own borders. The Iranian regime reached out and touched and they hit U.S. forces. We have no reports of casualties at this hour, and they reached out and touched, basically sending a message to President Trump. You know, essentially, now what are you going to do about it? Because they do have a very significant inventory of these missiles, both short range, medium range, which go longer distances. We know for the future they're working on long range missiles. That's not relevant terribly tonight. But the Iranian regime, the supreme leader, the Iranian leadership tonight, they made a decision to reach out and touch the President of the United States military force.
Yeah. Barbara Starr. Barbara, thanks. There were significant activity, as you might imagine, at the White House, including preparations for a possible Oval Office address by President Trump tonight. We'll obviously bring that to you live. The Secretaries of State and Defense were seen going in to the White House just a short time ago. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs has arrived as well for what will likely be a very long night. Our Jim Acosta is there. Well, he joins us now. Jim, any response so far from the White House?
Not yet, Anderson. We understand from talking to officials over here that they're planning for the president to make some sort of statement tonight, whether that's in the Oval Office, whether it's even via paper statement. They are making those preparations right now. We do believe that he will be on camera making some sort of televised address to the nation, perhaps at the Oval Office at some point tonight about what has happened. This is obviously perhaps the biggest test of his presidency on day 2 of the president being back at the White House after his holiday break. Anderson, you were showing this video a few moments ago just to show you how dramatic a moment this is for the president. We did see exclusively over the last hour the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, the defense secretary, Mark Esper, and the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, all filing into the West Wing, just, a few dozen yards from where we're standing right now to go meet with the president and talk about these next steps. Now, obviously, we heard the president ratcheting up the rhetoric earlier today. He was essentially warning the Iranians that if they were to retaliate, he would strike back. And so at this point, he has essentially telegraphed his next move. And the question is, at this hour, Anderson, whether or not he takes that next step, which obviously would draw the United States closer and closer to war. One other thing we should note, Anderson, this evening, and I spotted this with my own eyeballs coming in to the White House grounds just a short while ago, a law enforcement official tells CNN that security measures have been upgraded around the White House grounds. There are some Secret Service officers with assault rifles at various checkpoints around this area. That is obviously precaution that the Secret Service is going to take because of just how very delicate the situation is right now, Anderson.
All right, Jim, I think we'll be talking to you probably throughout the night. CNN's Arwa Damon is in Baghdad for us tonight. Arwa, what are you learning about these attacks? What are you hearing?
Well, what we have been hearing at this stage is that at least the initial assessment is that there are no casualties among the U.S. military personnel at these locations when it comes to the Al Asad Air Base. And remember, the vast majority of military installations here don't just house U.S. forces, they house Iraqi security forces as well. And what an Iraqi security source was telling us is that there is an unknown number of casualties among the Iraqi forces that are at the Al Asad Air Base. We do not yet know if this means that they have been killed or wounded, but it goes to show you just how entrenched this country is ending up being in this growing battle, and this is exactly what the Iraqi government has been fearful of. It is unclear at this stage if this is just a single isolated message that perhaps Iran is sending, and if Iran's proxies here are also going to want to chime in their own way. Remember, they are not just enraged over the killing of Qasem Soleimani, but here in Iraq also of the death of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was the leader of Kataib al-Bawla, a Iranian proxy here, a very powerful paramilitary force that most certainly does have significant capabilities. This is a force that the U.S. has said has targeted its military installations repeatedly in the past. We do understand that there has been some sort of a conversation between the upper echelons of the U.S. and the Iraqi government. This is right now a situation that is very much, as one senior Iraqi official was saying, staring down the abyss. This country does not know how to extract itself from this proxy battlefield, nor at this stage how to prevent itself from becoming an even bigger one. Remember, there is this huge push by the Iraqi government, by Shia parliamentarians, by these Shia paramilitary forces here to drive U.S. troops out of Iraq. That is Iran's main goal as well, and it is the goal of its proxies in this country, despite the fact that there is concern among some members of the Iraqi government as to what that would look like moving forward. But this most certainly, at this stage, Anderson, is going to cause a lot of fear here, not just for the potential security of U.S. military personnel, but also for the Iraqis who are alongside them at all of these bases, and for the Iraqi population. What is this going to mean for them moving forward if America and Iran continue playing out their war games in this country?
Yeah, or just, for folks who haven't spent time in Iraq, if you could just talk a little bit and briefly about the Shia paramilitary forces, about the Iranian proxies, just explain how that works, because it's sort of confusing for people who haven't been there. You have the Iraqi government, you have Iraqi military forces, Iraqi police personnel, and yet you have these paramilitary forces who have power, who have weapons, who, have freedom of movement. Can you just explain how many are there, and how could they play a role in this if Iran wanted to attack on multiple fronts at once?
Well, look, the exact number at this stage is unknown, but easily thousands, if not tens of thousands at this stage, potential fighters that these forces could quite possibly call upon. Look, Anderson, we have to go back to the years of America's occupation in Iraq, when out of the many different militant groups that the U.S. was fighting also included Shia militias, very powerful, mostly backed by Iran. They were the ones who were developing the EFP, those roadside bombs that were able to penetrate through U.S. armor. Many of these forces, these militias, ended up also, as Iraq moved forward throughout the years, creating political representation. Their political branches are in the Iraqi government. When ISIS was sweeping through Iraq, when it quite literally reached the gates of Baghdad, these various forces mobilized. They ended up being the initial frontline on-the-ground force that was driving ISIS away from the capital. They were the ones who were instrumental in recapturing key cities and towns from ISIS. Then the Iraqi government, to try to gain a certain measure of control over them, absorbed them into the Iraqi security forces, but they're only ostensibly actually under the control of Baghdad.
Olha, então já há notícias de feridos ou mortos iraquianos nesse ataque. Dos americanos ainda não se sabe. Mas se espera que daqui a pouco o Trump se pronuncie. Ele, claro que está esperando informações da base.
In this country that in the post-ISIS phase, Anderson, has become extremely powerful, both militarily and politically. And that dynamic really is at the very core of what is unfolding here.
Yeah, Arwa Damon, appreciate it. Again, we have video from Iranian state television, claims to be of the strike on the Al-Assad base shortly after the missiles began falling, and what appears to be a jab at President Trump, or at least a response to the killing of Iran's top General Soleimani. Iran's chief nuclear negotiator tweeted out this: no words, just the Iranian flag, a response, it seems, to the president's tweet of the American flag after the killing of General Soleimani. I want to go now to CNN's Fred Plankton, who is in Tehran, Iran. What's the reaction been in Iran?
Well, so far it's been quite interesting, Anderson, in that the Iranians really, since heard that there were missile impacts on those or near those American bases inside Iraq, the Iranians immediately took responsibility for it. Almost immediately as that took place, there were banners on state TV saying that the IRGC was claiming, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps was claiming responsibility for these ballistic missile attacks. And then also news agencies were sending out messages saying that there was a second wave of ballistic missiles that had been fired. So the Iranians clearly taking responsibility for this, and that's something that's absolutely key, because I've been speaking, Anderson, to Iranian officials over the past couple of days, and one of the things that struck them the most was when the U.S. hits Qasem Soleimani, that Iranian general, that the U.S. took responsibility for it. And with the U.S. doing that, the Iranians say that to them made it an open act of aggression towards Iran. And with that, they said it would require a response from the Iranians. What the Iranians have been telling me over the past couple of days is that there would be a military response, Anderson, and that military response would be against military installations. So that appears to be exactly what's been happening. And then you've had some of the messaging, which is only really becoming clear right now. For instance, at the funeral procession for Qasem Soleimani, there were scores of people who had placards with simply two words on them: hard revenge or harsh revenge. Well, guess what? The operation, according to a statement that I've just gotten from the Revolutionary Guard Corps, saying that this operation is actually called Operation Hard Revenge. It's interesting because on a Telegram channel from the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Revolutionary Guard Corps seems to indicate that if the U.S. responds to this retaliation, that the Revolutionary Guard Corps could respond then inside the United States. That's another threat that's coming out. Revolutionary Guard also warning the United States not to retaliate after these strikes that the Iranians are conducting right now. They're warning America's regional allies that have U.S. bases on their soil that if attacks against Iran are launched from those bases, those countries will become targets as well. Of course, that's highly significant in itself, Anderson. In the U.S. Now seeing how it wants to respond to this Iranian retaliation, what are some of the countries in the region that have U.S. bases on them going to think of this Iranian threat? The Iranians also, once again, threatening Israel, as we've seen in the past as well. But the significant thing, I think, is something that you talked about with Barbara, is the fact that the Iranians are using their ballistic missiles to do this. It's the most sophisticated weapons that they have in their arsenal, and it's certainly the case right now, and this is where I think the Iranians want to make a point of the fact that they are not using their proxy forces to strike back at America. They're using their own forces, and they're using homemade weapons, Iranian-made weapons, which they say are the most sophisticated in their arsenal. Anderson.
Fred Plankton, appreciate it. We'll continue to check back in with you. Goes without saying, we're going to check back with all our correspondents throughout the night as new developments warrant. Right now, we're joined by CNN military and diplomatic analyst, retired Rear Admiral General Kirby, retired Navy Commander Kurt Lippold, former commanding officer of the USS Cole, along with us also the New Yorker's Dexter Filkins, who's reported extensively on the region for years. Admiral Kirby, let me start with you. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps taking credit for the attacks. It's obviously a significant escalation from Iran, a response. What do you make of the form this attack has taken, given all the options, frankly, at Iran's disposal?
It's very clear to me that the way they did this was deliberately intended, not only to send a message to Donald Trump that they mean business in terms of retribution for Soleimani's death, but that they have the capability to cause real damage. That's why they chose these particular weapons, and that they were brazen enough to launch them from Iranian soil. So clearly it's a statement of not only their capability, but their willingness to use that capability. And so we'll see the president hopefully later tonight. I mean, what I think is going to be interesting to see is obviously how he responds to this, but the degree to which, trying to understand the degree to which, for him, decision space now is getting smaller. It's getting a little bit more closed as this pattern of escalation continues to increase. And that's the concern, that finding a de-escalation method, finding a diplomatic off-ramp here is going to become increasingly difficult for the administration now that the Iranians have so upped the ante with the use of these particular systems.
Commander Lippold, a former ambassador to Iran, and actually one of the former hostages who was held, who I talked to earlier today, was also a historian, said that throughout history, countries have been drawn into war, each side saying they do not actually want to go to war, that it's the other side. I'm wondering what you make of what we have seen tonight and what the next steps may be or could be avoided to be.
Well, I think right now what you see, Anderson, this is a prime opportunity for everyone to take a step back and, in fact, de-escalate from the scenario that's developing. Obviously, we had the strike against Soleimani, which was extremely effective and achieved our objective of taking out the #1 terrorist in the world that was working for the Iranian government. By the same token, the Iranians got their message across by sending these rockets into the base at Al-Assad and up to Erbil. Right now, we're kind of like that operational pause. We're assessing damage. We're seeing what's going on. Signals have been set and received for on both sides. This is actually the perfect opportunity to take that measured step back and determine, okay, do we need to continue an escalatory process, Or is this in fact the opportunity to allow diplomacy to step in, allow both sides to disengage, go to their neutral corners, figure out what we can do, and in fact, I see a greater opportunity to now come to the negotiating table than I think we've had previously.
Dr. Filkins, I'm wondering what you make of that. The president tweeted, which we were at the top of the broadcast just a couple days ago, if they strike an American base, we have all these, I'm paraphrasing, highly beautiful new expensive weapons that we'll send over there.
Yeah. My sense of this strike that happened this evening is that everything about it suggests that it was done primarily for Iranian domestic political reasons. They are basically speaking to their constituency and their public.
They're showing that we've done something.
Look, we did it. Yeah. I mean, if you start with the National Security Council meeting that the Iranians had yesterday, there was a story in the Times this morning, the New York Times, in which the Supreme Leader was quoted as demanding a proportionate response. I want us to do this, and I want us to do it, visibly and rapidly. And there were three sources for that story, and it struck me as that was an orchestrated leak. The Iranians wanted us to read that. They want to show, they want their own people to see it. They're trying to satisfy their public now, which is like very agitated, very angry, and wants revenge. And I think this was more about them than it was about us. They didn't kill any Americans, as far as we know.
Right, yeah, and we should say, these are very early reports. We really have no idea, and as we all know, and as everybody who's watching knows, early reports in any kind of conflict, kinetic activity are often wrong or just it's just too early to tell exactly what has gone on the ground there. We're also joined by General Mark Hertling, who has spent a lot of time, obviously, serving in Iraq. General Hertling, Dexter Filkins, I don't know if you just heard what he was saying, that this seems like a very thought-out response, and perhaps in response largely to domestic pressures within Iran for some sort of response, given all the other options at the disposal of Iran.
I agree completely with that, Anderson. We're talking about not only the timing of the attack, which appears to have coincided with the same time that Soleimani was attacked with the drone strike, that it's messaging toward the Iranian people, saying that we pride ourselves in countering any kind of actions by the great Satan. And then the third message, which I think is just as important, is it's done on Iraqi soil. It pulls them into this fray. Iran and Iraq have not had a history of great relationships. They've been trying to pull together a little bit more closely lately. There's been some dynamics involved in that, but to strike a U.S. base on Iraqi soil is sending not only a message to the United States, but to Iraq as well, of stay out of this proxy war, because if you're sucked into it, you're going to bear the repercussions as well. All of those are huge messaging attributes, to include the fact that they use ballistic missiles, not the kind of rockets that have been launched by Iranian U.S. bases in the past. These create some devastating effects, and the fact that there were 12 of them in the first wave to both Al-Assad and Erbil is significant, because those are two major U.S. bases right now.
Admiral Kirby, the Pentagon said they're working on initial battle damage assessments. Not sure exactly how that might take. Talk a little bit about if there are American casualties, and there are some reports based on at least one Iraqi source to our Damon that there are some Iraqi casualties, though we don't know if that means wounded or fatalities. If there are American casualties, or if this attack has not killed anyone, hopefully, what the chances for this breathing, as Commander Lippold said, might take place, kind of some breathing room to kind of reassess and perhaps de-escalate?
I definitely think that if there's casualties, particularly American casualties, that certainly closes down decision space for the president. It makes it harder for him not to respond in some way in a military fashion. Hopefully, obviously, there aren't going to be any deaths caused by this. But the fact that they conducted this strike in such a sophisticated manner from Iranian soil certainly itself is escalation enough. And I think, again, it's going to force the president to do something. And what that is, we don't know. And as for the de-escalation, I mean, I certainly agree that right now is a good time for everybody to try to find a way to get off this cycle of escalation and violence. The problem is that that's difficult to do now. This administration has basically cut off all ties and communications and diplomatic coordination with Iran when they pulled out of the Iran deal. So they've not given themselves much leeway, much leverage to have any kind of direct negotiations with Iran. I mean, it's not that it's not possible. Certainly, if things get tense enough, it could happen. It's just less likely now than it was certainly before we got into these more recent escalatory moves.
Commander Lippold, I mean, how difficult is it to maintain that communication once hostilities have actually started? I mean, in the past, there have been communications, and correct me if I'm wrong, between countries, even if there are strikes happening, because you do want those channels to at least remain open to have some sort of potential for de-escalation or off-ramps.
Well, I think right now, Anderson, what you'll find is there's probably more paths to communication open than before. We've never had direct communications with the Iranians. We have always done it diplomatically through the Swiss emissaries who have been willing to relay messages back and forth. But a key point, going back to the strikes themselves, that you have to remember is we actually have shown restraint already. Earlier today, we knew that these ballistic missile batteries were coming out of garrison. They were positioning. The transporter erector launchers were setting up. They knew that they were getting ready to fire. Every indication was there. If we wanted to stop that, we could have struck then as a preventive or preemptive measure and chose not to. Instead, we let the Iranians go ahead and fire them, which is significant.
Commander Lippold, I just want to go quickly to Urgente Acosta at the White House with some new information. Jim?
Yeah, we're still waiting to find out exactly what the president is going to do in terms of, giving a statement to the nation. We're monitoring that. He's apparently meeting with advisors as we speak. We saw those top advisors entering the White House a few moments ago. But Anderson, I wanted to pass along something that I picked up on from a source close to the White House who has spoken with the president in recent days. This source essentially saying the president has no choice at this point but to retaliate against Iran based on some of the talk that this source heard down at Mar-a-Lago and some of the other things the president has been saying in recent days. And according to this source, Trump has already set a standard that he's going to do a massive retaliation, this source said. If he fails to do that, I think he looks weak. Those are the words coming from a source close to the White House who has spoken with the president in recent days. I've spoken with other Republican officials up on Capitol Hill, and there is a concern, I will tell you, Anderson, even on the Republican side of the aisle, that this thing could get out of control. Now, obviously, we haven't heard from the president yet. We don't have a full assessment as to what damage has been done on the ground in Iraq. But this is a significant moment, obviously, for the president, and people who are close to this president seem to understand that all too well at this moment, Anderson.
All right, Jim Costa, appreciate that. Joining us right now is Democratic Congresswoman and former Navy helicopter pilot Mikey Sherrill, who serves on the House Armed Services Committee. Congresswoman, as I mentioned, you're a Navy veteran. As a veteran, what is, and as a member of Congress, what's your reaction to this attack tonight by Iran?
Well, as a veteran, I think my first thoughts are really for the families. A lot of us have signed up in the past to go serve our country. We know that we might put ourselves in danger, but it's the families often that are sitting home waiting for news from their loved ones. And right now, I just keep thinking of all of those families who are just waiting to hear from their service member.
Are you confident that the Pentagon would have seen these attacks coming, that U.S. personnel, equipment would have been protected in case of something like this? I mean, I'm not sure what the hardened capabilities are on either of these bases.
Well, we certainly were expecting an attack from Iran, and I know we were moving troops to try to protect them as best we could. And so I know we've been very thoughtful about that. I'm just hoping that we hear that there are no casualties. Certainly, right now, seeing the number of missiles being shot at the bases there, I have a great deal of concern, but I'm still very hopeful.
We've been talking about the fact that ballistic missiles were fired from inside Iran, according to the Defense Department, as opposed to smaller scale rockets fired from Iranian proxies. What do you believe should happen next, could happen next?
Well, Anderson, that's why we in Congress have been saying we need all of the information that the administration has so we can help make good decisions for our country. As you know, we are the body from the Constitution that declares war I certainly want to make sure that we don't end up, from this administration, finding ourselves in another unending war. We want to make sure that we're very thoughtful, that cooler heads prevail, and we don't simply see escalation after escalation after escalation, and we find ourselves in a situation that we didn't thoughtfully and strategically determine was in the best interest of our country.
Congresswoman Cheryl, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anderson.
Back now with our military, security, and regional expert, Dexter Phillips, spent a lot of time in the region, a lot of extraordinary reporting Dexter has done and continues to do. Just in terms of, we were talking about the Iranian proxy forces, the Shia paramilitary groups and stuff. If there is now this drumbeat to respond for this administration, if there's a back and forth, the options on the table for Iran, it just seems to me, they're multi-fronts, and we're not just talking about in Iraq or Syria. It's really wherever U.S. forces are and or other U.S. Civilians or installations.
Anywhere. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you just take Iraq, they fired the missiles today, but they could have used one of their militias inside the country. I mean, they certainly are. Those militias have proven themselves to be willing to act on behalf of the Iranians. But the Iranians, historically, particularly through Hezbollah, they've shown a capability to act all over the world. I mean, Thailand, India, Nigeria, Latin America, they can strike pretty much anywhere they want.
Right. There's U.S. troops in Somalia. There's operations going on,
and U.S. civilians too.
Yeah.
I mean, the things the Iranians have proved themselves to be very good at in the past are truck bombs and hostage taking, and they haven't done anything like that yet, but they certainly could.
General Hurtley, just in terms of kind of next steps, how in the past these situations have either kind of de-escalated or how they have escalated.
I'll preface by first saying, Anderson, that it's an old tenet that it's very easy to fall into a war or stumble into a war. It's a whole lot difficult to get out. Let's put this in perspective. Iran is four times the size of Iraq. They have about 3 times the population, and as we saw in the news over the last couple of days, they are very rabid, for the most part, in supporting their government. You're talking about a very large military, to include the Quds Force, and the ability to strike back in not only conventional methods, but also in unconventional means, such as cyber attacks, along with the conventional attacks. You're talking about a nation that, truthfully, probably Gerard McCorvey will say the same, that from about the 1980s, we've looked at different exercises and, in fact, war games of how would we tackle an Iranian regime if we ever got into a conflict there. It's extremely challenging, not only from the standpoint of going against a very challenging force, but a terrain and a demographic that's very tough as well. The president tweeted out about how we have billions of dollars worth of new equipment. Well, frankly, that's not true. And anyone in the military that tells you we suddenly went to a Walmart and got a bunch of new Patriot missiles and new tanks and new submarines and new aircraft carriers knows how long those things take to get into the pipeline. We have a budget to purchase more and to refresh what we've seen over 20 years of war take its toll on our equipment. But right now, it would be a very strong challenge to go up against the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Admiral Kirby, you talk about those war games, the game that you get out. How do you see the potential for this in terms of escalation?
Well, I mean, obviously that depends on what decisions the president makes. I'm sure that they're teeing up some options for him, probably from low to high in terms of intensity and the level of violence. I think my supposition is that if they're looking at military targets right now, they're probably looking at command and control facilities or launch areas, or trying to get at the source of these attacks rather than prepping for an all-out conventional conflict with Iran, which, as General Hertling rightly points out, would be extraordinarily difficult and very bloody. I mean, it's one of the top 10 armies in the world just in terms of size, and Iran's a much bigger country than Iraq. So, I mean, I don't think, and I'd be surprised if that's really where this is going. But I think in terms of kinetics right now, they're probably teeing up options that make sense to address the specific origin or capabilities that were put in place tonight against al-Assad.
Commander Lippold, you talked about, the possibility of de-escalation and kind of taking a breath, taking a pause, seeing, what the casualties are, what the situation is, and what the potential for de-escalation is. How does that work when there isn't, or it doesn't seem as if there's diplomatic channels that are at least open or, vibrant at this point?
Well, I think, Anderson, we take advantage of the channels we know are there. As I mentioned before, you've got the Swiss that we have always been open to be able to talk to the Iranians.
Right. The Swiss represents U.S. interests in Iran. For those who don't know, there's not obviously an American embassy anymore in Iran.
Yes, the other ones might be actually the European powers. Obviously, they were very connected with the JCPOA, or the Iran Nuclear Agreement. Germany, France, both of them obviously are going to have connections within the Iranian government that we could work through and use them as pathways for communication. So I think there's a variety of ways to do it. It's whether we actually choose to do that, and we may do that in concert with or parallel with preparing for more kinetic options if the Iranians want to continue this fight.
Dexter, one of the things when I'm just listening to Commander Lippold, who's essentially talking about the possibility of using Switzerland or European allies. Obviously, our relationships with a lot of European allies is not what it was before, and it doesn't seem like they were necessarily informed about the attack on Soleimani, and I don't know where they would be in terms of willingness to be involved.
Well, I think they'd be happy to try, because I think
just to avert any kind of...
Yeah, I think this is like freaking them out, but I think the whole... starting with President Trump withdrawing from the nuclear agreement, but his entire posture towards the Iranian government, which they see essentially as regime change, they don't like it. They've made that really clear. If they could have their way, I think it's fair to say the Europeans would go back, they'd restore the nuclear agreement, they'd put it all back in place and kind of go back to essentially what the Obama administration
as someone who spent a lot of time in Iraq, the fact that this, if there are Iraqi casualties here, and this attack was, an attempt to bring Iraq into this, how does that play out on the Iraqi front? Not only these Shia paramilitary forces, but you have the Iraqi parliament who's already said U.S. forces should leave. If U.S. forces leave, and there's many obviously Americans who would like to see U.S. forces get out altogether from Iraq, the irony is that that's exactly what Soleimani and Iran have wanted all along from the beginning, was to get U.S. forces out.
It is. It's ironic, and I think that it's classic. They're literally stuck in the middle. They have Iran, which is right next door, and they have the United States, and they're both coming at them all the time and saying, I want you, and the other one's saying the same thing. And I think the Prime Minister there, Adel Abdul-Mahdi, who's really about as pro-Western, pro-American Prime Minister as you're going to get in Iraq, he needs the Americans. I don't think, whatever he's saying publicly or whatever he's telling the Parliament, I think in his heart, he would like to keep the Americans.
He needs the Americans because...
To play him off against Iran. Because otherwise he's powerless. They'll thoroughly dominate the government there.
Jim Acosta standing by at the White House. Jim, what are you hearing?
Yeah, Anderson, we should update our viewers that at this point, it does not appear the president will make an address to the nation tonight. We are hearing from the White House Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham that the president will not appear in front of the cameras tonight, will not be making an address to the nation about what is unfolding tonight in Iraq. The possibility of a paper statement, I suppose, still exists, or a tweet of some sort, I suppose, but as of right now, we don't expect that to happen. Obviously, in situations like this, Anderson, we've seen this movie before. They have made preparations for these kinds of statements in the past and then decided ultimately not to do them. The other thing we should point out is that some of the top advisors who are meeting with the president, people like the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and others who were here for meetings with the president this evening, they have also departed the White House. What all of that means, obviously, we're going to be talking to our sources over the next several hours to determine exactly what was going on behind the scenes over here at the White House. But at least for the very moment, we can at least update our viewers and say that the president does not appear to be looking to make a statement to the nation tonight here at the White House, Anderson.
So just to be clear, you're saying that Pompeo, Milley, Esper, that they have left now?
We believe they have all left at this point. We just saw, that's right, the Defense Secretary, the Secretary of State, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs all file out of the White House within the last 10 or 15 minutes, I would say, Anderson. The Vice President as well. They were all here for about an hour, hour and a half, meeting with the President behind closed doors. The White House Press Secretary was also meeting with the President. They were all going over what has transpired in Iraq tonight, but it appears at the moment, at the very least, that the President is not going to be at least making a statement to the nation over the airwaves in terms of what the next steps will be for the U.S. Obviously, this is a very tender, delicate moment, and I think that all of that is being taken into consideration at this point.
All right. Well, we'll see if he decides to communicate in another forum tonight. Jim Costa, I appreciate it. We're going to take a short break. A reminder, we're live at the 11 o'clock hour as well. CNN's live, of course, throughout the entire night. Coming up next, how this crisis could open the door to the return of forces such as ISIS. We'll hear from someone who wrote the book on it as our live coverage continues.
Bem, é o seguinte, vocês ouviram aí, o Trump não vai falar nada por hoje a respeito do que aconteceu no Irã. A reunião dele com o Mike Pompeo já acabou. Ou ele não vai falar porque está preparando alguma resposta em sigilo, ou é porque ainda não conseguiu informações precisas do que aconteceu. O que se sabe até agora é que 2 bases foram atacadas, muitos mísseis disparados, dezenas de mísseis, segundo os iranianos. Já se sabe que há feridos entre soldados iraquianos, porque nas 2 bases havia tanto soldados americanos quanto soldados iraquianos, mas nenhuma informação a respeito de feridos e mortos americanos. Agora é de madrugada em Bagdá, são mais ou menos 5 horas da manhã. Em Washington está anoitecendo. Hoje não saberemos mais nada. Os iranianos também não fizeram novos bombardeios, é claro, estão esperando a resposta dos Estados Unidos, e nós aqui também vamos esperar pacientemente, então, amanhã para termos novas notícias. Então, por enquanto, muito obrigado a todos vocês por assistirem esse programa, e amanhã de manhã estarei de volta com novas notícias e novos comentários a respeito da escalada do conflito entre Estados Unidos e Irã. Boa noite, até amanhã.